So hello and welcome to this NPTEL course entitled Introduction to Cultural Studies. In this lecture, we'll begin with Zolfranco Lyotard's The Postmodern Condition, which is obviously subtitled A Report on Knowledge. So this should be on your screen, The Postmodern Condition, A Report on Knowledge. So in this lecture, I'll just give you an introduction to this text and also talk a little bit about postmodernism in general and how postmodernism as a movement, as a condition, as a way, as an examination of cultural conditions is very useful for us, not least if you're doing cultural studies. So this lecture will be spent almost entirely introducing Lyotard, introducing postmodernism, and sort of looking at the connection between postmodernism in general and cultural studies, and how cultural studies can draw on postmodernism as a stylistic, as a movement, as an aesthetic, as a political condition. So as the very title suggests of this book, The Postmodern Condition, A Report on Knowledge, it looks at the ontology of knowledge, the discursive quality of knowledge. So Lyotard, what he does in this particular book is quite revolutionary given the time in which this book was first produced. And obviously there have been a lot of contestations on this book. And this kind of way of looking at knowledge, this kind of way of looking at the condition, the cultural condition of its times is quite sort of provocative in many sense. And at the very outset, we saw when I gave the introductory video of this particular course, I sort of looked at how this book, The Postmodern Condition, is a very prophetic book in the sense that it really helps us understand the world we live our world. We live in a world and we live in lives today. The kind of conditions, the kind of knowledge networks that we inhabit and internalize today. So in that sense, this book becomes quite prophetic. This book becomes quite topical to our times. So what is postmodernism in general? So before we sort of move into this book, it's helpful for us to understand what postmodernism is, and what are the conditions, what are the sort of stylistic markers of postmodernism, and how is postmodernism a very useful way of looking at culture. So generally speaking, postmodernism as a movement, as a sort of temporal category, is that sort of artistic, cultural, political phase which pervades after the Second World War. And when I say after the Second World War, I mean sort of after 1945, after 1947, etc. And if you look at the political condition of the Western world after the Second World War, we find that this is a time also when imperialism, Western European imperialism, was beginning to end. So all the major colonies of the empire were sort of getting their freedom. A classic case in point is India, being India. So India became independent in 1947, 2 years after the Second World War. But we knew that by the time the World War ended, Britain was bankrupt, and Britain was in no condition to retain its empire, retain India as a colony. So postmodernism as a movement begins to happen around that particular time. It sort of overlaps with the end of imperialism. Now, what it does, what it tells us immediately, is that how the imperialist narratives on race, on knowledge, on science, on discourse in general, so those things also begin to dry up after the Second World War. So Second World War may be seen as an epoch, as a sort of paradigm shift in not just political system, but also in knowledge systems, in knowledge networks. So postmodernism has this temporal overlap with the end of imperialism after the Second World War. And what that also does is it sort of bankrupts Europe, it bankrupts West culturally, morally, socially, financially, ideologically as well. Now, what Lyotard does in this particular book, he looks at the very interesting collusion between science and knowledge, and he looks at the discursivity of scientific knowledge and how scientific knowledge can be quite discursive in quality. And this is a condition, this is a criterion which we'll keep revisiting throughout the lectures that we have on this particular book. But just to give you an idea of postmodernism, what postmodernism does as a movement in general, and obviously I'm sort of simplifying for the purpose of this course, but it's a helpful simplification, I hope, and that is it reveals the constructed quality of texts, it reveals the constructed quality of narratives. It sort of shows us how narratives are formed. And what it also does, almost simultaneously with this revelation, is that it promotes and triggers a general incredulity towards meta-narratives. And this is a very, very important condition. An incredulity towards meta-narratives, a suspicion towards anything which is essentialized, anything which is a grand narrative. So postmodernism in general could be seen as a grand narrative killer. right? A killer of grand narrative, someone, a movement which does away with any kind of grand narrative, a movement which does away with any kind of universal knowledge. So universality, the entire idea of being a grand narrative, the general conditions of being a grand narrative. So these are the conditions which go away with postmodernism. Postmodernism does away with these these assumptions, these presuppositions. Now, obviously, this has bearings on the political sphere, this has bearings on the cultural sphere, this has bearings on the linguistic sphere, on the literary sphere, on the scientific sphere as well. Now, what we have instead of a grand narrative of knowledge, which was largely a Western Eurocentric narrative anyway, we have different micro-narratives which contest for credibility. And this contestation for credibility becomes a very important condition for postmodernism in general. So the postmodern condition, a report on knowledge by Lyotard, it becomes a very important document, not just for the times in which it was written in the 80s, but also for us today. Because what we know today is knowledge is perhaps the most coveted commodity in the political systems that we have today. So we have, when I say knowledge is a coveted commodity, I mean knowledge becomes a very important category of surveillance, of invasion, of preservation, of protection, security, etc. So all of us are worried about our data. All of us are worried about how our personal information may be used, how it may be appropriated, sometimes illegitimately, sometimes in a very state-sanctioned kind of way. But the long and short of it, the entire thing is, we are basically data units. We are basically units of data, and we are numbers. We are certain numbers. We are certain information which are heavily coded. And this coded quality of existence today is something which is examined by postmodernism quite persuasively, quite compellingly. So this particular book by Lyotard is a very compelling study, is a very compelling argument about knowledge in the postmodern times. And it sort of argues how instead of military warfare, what we have today is knowledge warfare. And that's something which is quite prophetic, as I mentioned, something which we keep seeing today in different kinds of disguises, different kinds of discourses. So, for instance, we have countries accusing each other of stealing data, of hacking the systems during elections. So we all know what happened during the latest American presidential election, and there's a very strong suspicion that it was hacked by certain outside forces, most notably by the US, by the Russian forces, by the Russian intelligence, military intelligence, etc. Then we have WikiLeaks, we have all kinds of information invasions. So information becomes a very important category in postmodernism. And why is information so important? Why is postmodernism so obsessed with information? Why does it examine information so relentlessly? And that is because the human subject it becomes an informative category in the postmodern times. So it's essentially digitalized, it's essentially coded into different kinds of digits, different kinds of discursive digits. So digits are not discourse free. Digits are not insensitive to discursivity. So discursivity becomes sine qua non, if you will, of the postmodern condition. And the postmodern examination of that condition becomes an examination of that kind of discursivity, that kind of a coded system, right? So a large part of postmodernism is basically an act of decoding, decoding the textuality, decoding the hidden constructed quality, the concealed constructed quality of text. Text is sometimes masquerade as presuppositions. Text is sometimes masquerade as givens, as grand narratives in different discursive conditions. So the postmodern condition, report on knowledge, becomes actually a report on the narrative, the discursive quality of knowledge. And this discursivity is something which we keep highlighting throughout this course. If you remember, we keep talking about the collusion between discursivity and identity, discursivity, identity, and corporeality. So the human body is discursive, the human identity is discursive, and of course we can add on the added component of the informative quality. So the informative quality and the discursive quality, they go hand in hand in postmodern times. So if you think of films, a very important, a very crucial reflection of this kind of condition is if you look at popular cinemas. If you look at the Matrix trilogy, for instance, a film like The Truman Show. These are films which tell us that our condition, our life that we live today, are basically a series of codes. And these are codes which sometimes blur the borderline between reality and virtuality. And that's a study which is taken by Baudrillard, as some of you would know. the entire idea of the simulacrum, the entire idea of the blurring borderlines between reality and virtuality, between the real world and the virtual world, is something that a postmodern condition keeps on highlighting. And the postmodern examination is basically an attempt to unpack those categories between virtuality and reality. Now, towards the end of this book, and we'll study those sections in great details, towards the end of this book, Lyotard offers a very interesting definition of postmodernism. So one of the problems with postmodernism is it seems to be a bit of an oxymoron. It seems to be a bit of a paradox if you're going by a purely temporal definition of postmodernism. So when we say this is postmodern, we are essentially saying it's something which comes after modern, something which comes after the present time. So it's essentially a futuristic kind of a movement, a futuristic form, but that's not quite the case. That kind of a strictly temporal definition of postmodernism makes it slightly nebulous and vague as an ontological category. Now, what we have instead is a more complex definition, or a more complex conception of postmodernism offered by Lyotard towards the end of this book, which we'll study in great details. But just for the purpose of the summary, for the purpose of this introduction, it will suffice to say that what Lyotard does, he places the postmodern as something which comes before the modern, not after the modern, but before the modern. And what does he mean by modern? He means when you see something as modern, we say that that particular movement, that particular art form, that particular cultural condition is systematized, is theorized, has a palpable shape, has a present reality. So postmodernism is that which comes before that shape. So postmodernism is something which is, one might say, forever formative in its ontological being, ontological state. So ontologically forever formative is something which is always happening, something which is always becoming. So its entire act of becoming, the entire act of appropriation, misappropriation, de-appropriation, these become very crucial sort of activities in postmodernism. And these activities become very important for a purpose of a study. And we see how one of the things which we can do from this book is when you go later to someone like Judith Butler, we find that how Butler takes up a very postmodern, a very post-structuralist way of looking at gender, whereby gender becomes, again, a very coded system, but also and equally it becomes a very performative quality. So you perform different kinds of gender identities. You become, you re-become, you unbecome certain identities depending on your location, on your condition. So these are some of the very important takeaways from this book. And it's a really crucial book for the purpose of our course on cultural studies, because if you're looking at culture as something which is a combination of textuality and experientiality, as something which is a text as well as an experience, the entire idea of the reported knowledge becomes a very crucial component in that kind of a perspective. And again, if you remember at the very outset of this course, we had defined culture as an asymmetric entanglement of abstraction and materiality, and likewise as an asymmetric entanglement of discursivity and experientiality, of something which is constructed and as well as something which is experienced. And later on, we'll look at the book by Ian Hacking, where he warns us, where he guards us against a sort of an over-reliance on the social constructionist theory, which does away with the experientiality of culture. So culture is also an experience. It's not just a series of texts, it's not just a series of codes which are to be appropriated and reappropriated, but it's also a series of experiences which are to be lived. They have a sort of a lived reality quotient. So culture as a lived reality quotient is something very important for the purpose of our course today. So the postmodern condition, a reported knowledge, it sort of gives us a very interesting overview of these categories: culture as a code, culture as a knowledge system, science as a knowledge system, science as an informative system, and this entire battle between information and reality, how information can become discursive in quality. And the other thing that Lyotard does brilliantly in this book is that it draws on Wittgenstein's idea of language games. And that's something, again, we'll study in great details when we look at this book extensively in the subsequent lectures. For the purpose of this introduction that we are doing today, it's very important to define what language games are, according to Lyotard. So language games are those different micro-activity, are the inscriptions, utterances, articulations, and performances, which are constantly used to enact and embody a subject position. right? And that's a working definition that we can use for the purpose of our course. Language games are those enactments, those inscriptions that are the embodiments and extensions of a particular subject position. Now, every subject position, as Lyotard would argue in his book, is born into a language game. So language games are also the set of rules, a set of those inscriptive rules, which are the matrix into which a subject is born and with which a subject negotiates. And this entire negotiation with language games become a very key condition for postmodern existence, according to Lyotard. So a great deal of this book is spent, is sort of last chunks of this book are used to explain what language games are. Language games as a very crucial category. Language games is a very important sort of play of identities, inscription of identities, articulation of identities, etc. And these become very important for the purpose of our course as well in general. So this particular book is a very specifically important book for us, but also is a very generally important book for us because, it's a very pivotal book for the purpose of our course because it connects to lots of other texts that we do for this course. So for instance, when I look at much later in this course, when we look at Bell Hooks' book's Understanding Patriarchy, which is actually about a grand narrative called Patriarchy. And Hooks talks about how the grand narrative is formed, and without anyone realizing that this is actually a formation, a textualization. And the grand narrative is formed precisely because it appears to be non-constructed, precisely because it appears to be, something grand, something, fabulous, something which is, has a meta-narrative quality to it, something which is outside the narrative constructed scope, right? So this whole idea of patriarchy becoming a grand narrative is a very important sort of understanding of how grand narratives take place, how grand narratives take over our logical, reasonable understanding, how they become an unquestionable category. You can't question those grand narratives simply because you're not aware of the discursivity, you're not aware of the constructed quality. You simply experience it passively. But that experience is an unquestioned experience, a very numbed kind of experience, which you suffer. So, Bell Hooks' book, Understanding Patriarchy, can also be linked to Lyotard's Postmodern Conditional Report on Knowledge because, what that particular book tells us is that we are blindly replicating certain language games. The language games of patriarchy, where certain moves are done according to certain rules, certain preset rules. And we're not negotiating with the rules in terms of subverting them, but we are replicating them. We are appropriating and consuming those rules, those language games, blindly and passively. And this passive consumption of language games also becomes a problem in terms of conforming to a particular grand narrative, in terms of conforming to a particular, mega, massive narrative, which does away with this constructed quality. Now, what this book does, among many of the things that I've just mentioned, it also talks about science and how science becomes a very important form of discourse, how science becomes a very important, it's a bit of a disguised discourse in a way, because you don't realize the discursivity of science, you don't realize the discursive quality of science. You think of science as a discourse-free entity, as a discourse-free epistemic engagement, but actually it's a deeply discursive quality. And the deep discursive quality of this epistemic engagement, which is science, is something which is highlighted by Lyotard over and over again throughout this book. Now, towards the end of this book, as I mentioned, when it gives us a definition of what postmodernism is, when it talks about how postmodernism is actually something which is pre-modern, something which comes before the modern, something which is forever formative, it gives us two very important examples, literary examples. One is Marcel Proust, and this magnificent book that he wrote, In Search of Lost Time. Another is James Joyce, Finnegan's Wake. And again, we'll look at the section in great details when you do the text, but just for the purpose of introduction, this is what Lyotard offers as a distinction between the modern and the postmodern. And he says, when we look at Proust, when we look at the entire idea of remembrance and things past, we find the language is very, very nostalgic. It's sort of slipping away. It's something which is sort of decentered to a certain extent. However, with all the decentering, with all the slipping away, with all the play of language, what is retained is the original ontology of the novel, the original ontology of the narrative that is retained. But when it comes to Joyce's Finnegan's Wake, we find that that original ontology is done away with. There's no original ontology left, right? And that's something which is completely done away with. We have looking for a new ontology. it's a hollowed out center. The center doesn't hold anymore. It's a pure state of centerlessness. And the centerlessness is something which characterizes a postmodern art form. It's something which is finding a center. The entire art is actually geared, it's designed towards finding and forming a particular shape, a particular structure, which is not yet there in the first place. So that becomes a very important distinction between the modern and the postmodern, according to Lyotard. And later in this book, following that kind of an argument, we find there's another almost a debate that Lyotard sets out with another very, very important philosopher called Eugen Habermas. Now, Habermas has, is a very, very important philosopher in terms of how he theorizes the idea of modernity as an unfinished project. Some of you may have read the book already. Habermas's Modernity as an Unfinished Project. But more importantly, what it does in that book is that he gives us an idea of the public space. The public space as a space for consensus, as a space where different kinds of dialogues come together to create a consensus, to create some kind of an agreement, intellectual, affective agreement across people. Now, Lyotard contests that severely. Lyotard is very much against that kind of a space formation, that kind of a public space that is advocated by Habermas. And this again highlights the difference between the modern and the postmodern traditions, the modern and the postmodern ways of looking at knowledge, of looking at associations, affiliations, etc. Now, Lyotard says quite clearly, and he says that particular argument runs along this book in different places. But in the end, when he takes up issues with Habermas, he says quite clearly that kind of a consensus can very quickly become a grand narrative. So that entire consensus in a public space where different voices come and mix and merge, that can become a grand narrative in its own right, and that's something which we must warn ourselves against. So this warning against a particular grand narrative formation is something which Lyotard keeps highlighting, and it defines the postmodern condition as an incredulity towards meta-narratives, an incredulity towards grand narratives. This entire idea of incredulity becomes very important. This entire idea of being suspicious, not believing in grand narratives, become very, very important for Lyotard, and that becomes a very important definition for us doing cultural studies, because you find oftentimes in culture we assume, we consume, and we sort of de-interpret certain conditions, and we sort of accept those conditions as grand narratives without questioning them. But a postmodern condition is a very important sort of realization, a very important act of awareness. So the entire book becomes an act of awareness. The entire book becomes quite polemical in its scope, and quite prophetic as well, which tells us exactly the dangers of reification. And then this reification or commodification, where something becomes a commodity, something becomes a standardized, essentialized commodity, doesn't just happen at the level of materiality. It also happens perhaps more sinisterly and perhaps more surreptitiously at the level of abstraction. So if you look at knowledge, for instance, knowledge again is a very interesting entanglement of materiality and abstraction, and the entire idea of reified knowledge, the entire idea of commodified knowledge, or knowledge as a commodity, is something that is constantly highlighted by Lyotard. Now, what that highlighting does, what the idea of looking at knowledge as a commodity does quite clearly, is that it looks at knowledge as a non-innocent category. It's not something which is apolitical. So there's no such thing as apolitical knowledge. There's no such thing as, according to Lyotard, as non-discursive knowledge. So every knowledge is discursive. Every knowledge is an act of discursivity. Every knowledge is an affirmation of discursivity. So this affirmation, this articulation, this activity in discursivity is something which characterizes postmodernism. So where your entire location in discursivity is highlighted. And this again connects Lyotard to some of the other philosophers who we cover in this course, more importantly Butler. And Butler says quite clearly in General Trouble, which we will cover subsequently, she says quite clearly that true liberation or true agency is not outside discursivity. True agency lies inside discursivity, inside the discursive map. So true agency lies in a negotiation, in a human subject's negotiation or navigation with discursivity. And that becomes a very important condition for Lyotard as well. Obviously, he talks about language games, and he sees how everyone occupies nodal points in language games. So the idea of nodal points become very important for Lyotard. Nodal points are those points where information and interactions crisscross each other and different kinds of discursive conditions. And Lyotard says quite clearly, no matter how unprivileged someone is, no matter how agency-less someone is in terms of financial agency, in terms of economic and cultural agency, it is virtually impossible not to occupy any nodal point, not to occupy any position which doesn't have an intersection of knowledge, intersection of epistemic activity. So this entire idea of epistemic activity becomes a very important quality in postmodernism, and that epistemic activity is a very non-innocent process, and that's why I said a little while ago, knowledge is discovered, knowledge is revealed to be non-innocent in a postmodern time. So a reported knowledge, obviously, over here is a debunking of the myth of innocent knowledge, is a debunking of the myth of non-discursive knowledge. And he spends a good deal of time talking about scientific knowledge and how scientific knowledge, which claims to be non-discursive, which claims to be sort of ideological, is basically is masquerading. But because what happens in terms of scientific knowledge is that certain kinds of discourses, certain kind of discursive, deep discursive structures are smuggled inside the scientific narratives, and we have oftentimes have collusion between science and ideology, science and different kinds of discursive investments in terms of concocting different discourses which are sanctioned. So this entire idea of sanctioned discourses becomes very important, because then that goes a step closer towards becoming a grand narrative. If you sanction something scientifically, if you sanction something empirically, then basically you're protecting that from questioning, you're protecting that from any kind of interrogation, any kind of deconstruction or demystification. So you're mystifying it with science. So again, we're looking at a very important utility of science. So science becomes a utility-based knowledge network which sanctions certain discourses, which legitimizes certain ways of looking at life, certain ways of understanding, examining, quantifying matter, etc. Now, if those of us interested in imperialism and racism and studies on those imperialism and racism obviously go hand in hand in different kinds of collusive qualities, collusive conditions. But what we find is quite interesting. We find in late 19th century, with the emergence of criminology, with the emergence of the degeneration discourses, we find more often than not the idea of race became very, very important, and the idea of race was empirically corroborated. So, the superior white race and the inferior black race, the innate inferiority of the black man, the innate violence of the black man. So these are very, very discursive categories. These are, today obviously we know that all these are sort of man-made, manufactured myths, which were used essentially to sanction and legitimize imperialism. But the point is, at those times, in late 19th century, we find these are discourses which are completely backed by scientific studies, quote-unquote studies, of course. These are discourses which are backed, which are supported, which are corroborated by different kinds of scientific collusions. So we had an entire quote-unquote scientific proof of the innate inferiority of the African based on skull size, the innate criminality of the colonized based again on skull size and anatomical measurements, etc. So criminology as a discipline, criminology as a way of looking at human anatomy is a very physiognomic, metonymic system. So that becomes very discursive. That became historically a very discursive, ideological, sort of ideologically biased knowledge network. But the point is, that bias, the ideological bias, was very carefully concealed in the idea of the scientific backing, in the idea of how this was empirically true, there was empirically, there were the evidences, etc. So there are lots of published articles, there were lots of very prestigious publications which were actually corroborating the innate inferiority of the African, the innate violence of the African, the laziness of the Asian, and all kinds of stereotypical essentialized epistemic systems. That's something which we find, which is wonderfully explored in Edward Said's Orientalism, which is entirely about the essentialization of the Orient by the West. How the Orient becomes a very handy instrument of stereotypification, a very handy instrument, a very handy object of essentialization. But the point is, such essentialization happened, which are often backed by scientific investments, by scientific knowledge networks. So science and discourse, science and ideology go hand in hand in more ways than one, and that's something which Lyotard often highlights in this particular book. And that again connects us to the broader postmodern condition that we started off with, the postmodern condition, with its suspicion towards grand narratives, with its incredulity towards grand narratives, is actually a condition, a way of examination which keeps unpacking the constructed quality, the textual quality of knowledge formation, the textual quality of knowledge networks. So the textuality of knowledge becomes a very important category in postmodernism, right? Because postmodernism is always, if not, it's nothing if not, an examination of discursivity, an examination of constructed quality, an examination of experientiality. And again, we're looking at a very interesting entanglement of experientiality and discursivity, and identity becomes a very important quality, a very important category in this framework. Because as I mentioned at the very beginning of this lecture, that what we find if you read this book, when we read this book, is that how identity is informative, and quality, how information identity become this next grand narrative in the postmodern times, in the postmodern sort of cultural climate, where Lyotard says quite clearly at one point, where countries don't invade each other with military anymore, but they invade each other informatively these days. And that's something which is so true to our times, where we have, like I said, we have hackings, we have people crashing in other people's computers, we have entire government systems, parallel systems, alternative government systems which are competing with each other for knowledge, etc. So the entire idea of surveillance, the entire idea of military intelligence, that becomes dependent on knowledge. So countries compete with each other for knowledge. So knowledge becomes the next resource, the next coveted commodity, and that's something which Lyotard highlights constantly. Now, you find a very fair reflection of that in cinema and popular cinema as well, and that's something which we might talk about a little later in subsequent lectures. Say, for instance, if you look at the modern spy cinema, which is released out of Hollywood, the major Hollywood production houses, and if you look at films such as the Bourne series films, the Bourne Identity, the Bourne Supremacy, the Bourne Ultimatum, you find that the entire Bourne series, which is a very smart cinema, a very smart spy cinema, we find that the entire commodity, the entire coveted commodity, is oftentimes just a little pen drive, just a little memory stick. And that little memory stick, that little pen drive, contains perhaps very, very vital and classified information, which might compromise entire governments, which might compromise entire government security. So again, knowledge becomes a very sort of coveted commodity, and not just that, it becomes a very discursive commodity as well. So this entire mingling of discursivity and commodification, discursivity and reification, and obviously these are discursively reified as well. These become very important categories of study in Lyotard's book, and obviously these happen in different kinds of language games and different kinds of mixture of preset rules and navigation with those rules, utterances and articulations within those rules. These become very, very important throughout this book, The Postmodern Condition. So that is basically why we are looking at this particular book in terms of a very pivotal position in our course in cultural studies. Now, I just mentioned how it connects to Butler, how it connects to Ian Hacking, how it connects to bell hooks, but also, and equally important, that we need to understand how this connects to the question of authority. So who contains authority in a postmodern times? Something which Lyotard also asks in this book. And later on in this course, we'll look at Michel Foucault's essay, What is an Author?, which is again a very important discourse analysis on authority, authorship, author identity, etc. But that's something which is sort of anticipated in this book as well, that kind of a study, where authority becomes, again, a very discursive quality. So authority and agency go hand in hand. An agency can be acquired, it can also be de-acquired, it can be given, it can be taken away. So these become very, very important categories in the postmodern times. The question of agency keeps coming up. Who acquires agency, and what's the modus operandi? What is the means? What are the means through which one can acquire agency? So the means obviously are economic, cultural, financial, etc. So how do you consume the capital? How do you consume the means? How do you appropriate the methods through which we acquire agency in the first place? So these are conditions, these are the very important questions that keep getting asked in a postmodern condition and report on knowledge. Okay, now the other thing, the counter narrative of this is also something which is worth bearing in mind. One of the very common accusations against postmodernism, something which keeps coming up, is that it ends up being a self-defeating game. It ends up becoming a self-reifying narrative. It reifies itself in his question, in his attack against reification. So the postmodern subversive act, the postmodern subversive coup can very quickly become reified, very quickly become commodified, it can very quickly become coded and become part of the status quo. And that is something which is quite often an accusation against postmodernism. Now, what Lyotard does in this particular book, he makes it very clear that postmodernism doesn't quite offer the solutions, and postmodernism doesn't quite offer the resolutions to crisis. Rather, it raises questions, it raises more complex questions, and to a certain extent, it is escapist in quality. To a certain extent, it does away with in real engagement as well. But the questions which are raised by postmodernism, they become very, very important for us, especially in cultural studies. And among the many questions, some of the key questions are the following. How are narratives formed? So how is a grand narrative formed? So what are the cultural, economic, informative conditions which are invested into the making of a grand narrative, right? So the making of a grand narrative is a very important quality, which is investigated, which is examined over and over again by postmodernism, the entire narrative formation. B, and what are the different kinds of identity markers in that kind of a narrative formation, right? So the identity markers in postmodernism are more often than not metonymic in quality. And what do I mean when I say metonymic? By metonymic, I mean fragmented in quality. So they are selective, they are fractured. So identity is more often than not fractured. Identity is more often than not selective in quality in the postmodern condition. So the postmodern condition often becomes a celebration of that kind of fractured identities, of that kind of metonymic identity. So this entire idea of metonymization, where you break down something into certain representative components, these become very important markers of postmodernism. So postmodernism doesn't really require a sense of wholeness. It doesn't really aspire for wholeness. It aspires for actually a deconstruction of wholeness, a deconstruction of any kind of a causal closure. And that's the third point which we need to bear in mind, the idea of the causal closure. Now, what is a causal closure? A causal closure is, a closure, a sense of finale, a sense of ending, which is acquired, which is reached through certain kinds of cause and effect logic. Now, postmodernism, among the many things which it does, it exposes the constructed quality of common sense. It exposes the constructed quality of logic. And obviously logic, the way we consume, the way we look at logic, is a very Eurocentric Enlightenment kind of phenomenon. And in that sense, postmodernism moves away from the Enlightenment logic, which is quite Cartesian in quality. The idea of the thinking man, the idea of I think, therefore I am. So the entire idea of agency rests on a thinking process. That kind of a logic, that kind of a causal structure of logic is done away with in postmodernism. And that is, again, another grand narrative, another meta-narrative that postmodernism is suspicious of, right? So, that logical system, the causal logical system, is something which is done away with postmodernism, right? So the Enlightenment logic, the causal logic, the Eurocentric logic is something which postmodernism does away with. Now, lastly, this might be a bit of a digression from this course, but postmodernism is quite akin to what we also classify as posthumanism in academic study today. Now, posthumanism obviously is something which comes after humanism, which again doesn't mean something which comes after humanity is gone or destroyed, etc. That wouldn't make much sense. But something which takes a revisionary look at humanism. The humanism, if we put in capital H, is a very Enlightenment narrative. It's a narrative about the primacy of man, the supremacy of man, and more often than not, it's the supremacy or primacy of the white man. Now, notice the very selective quality of such a narrative. It's the white man's racial selectivity in question. It's the man's gender selectivity in question. So it's a white man's rationality, which becomes the grand narrative of Enlightenment, imperialism, etc. Now, that kind of narrative, that white man's narrative, which is a grand narrative, is questioned by postmodernism as well as by posthumanism. And in that sense, postmodernism is quite akin stylistically, thematically, ontologically, as well as epistemologically with posthumanism as it is with post-structuralism. So with post-structuralism, the things become more semantic, while the relationship between signifier and signified gets problematized. So there's no causal relation between C-A-T, cat, and the animal cat. So these things become questioned, these things become quite slippery in quality. And postmodernism becomes, in a sense, a celebration of slipperiness, a celebration of simultaneity rather than something which is geared or designed towards causal closures. So closure becomes the postmodern condition. The post-modernity becomes a closure killer in a sense. It does away with closures. It's always sort of an open-ended kind of a narrative which anticipates more narratives to come. It doesn't really close in any particular point, but it anticipates and welcomes its own contestations. Now, if we take all these conditions in mind and look at representations, because representation becomes a very crucial and key category in postmodernism. Now, what is representation? Representation is obviously a way of telling a particular narrative, designing a particular narrative, and that designing, that telling, are often quite political in quality. So what do you design, what do you tell, what do you select, what do you include, what do you exclude? These become very political discursive questions that keep getting asked in postmodernism. Now, if you look at these kinds of designs, we find that when I look at the postmodern narratives, what it also celebrates is unreliability to a certain extent. So unreliability is something which is not lamented, but it's rather celebrated in postmodernism. So the entire unreliable narrator becomes a very popular trope in postmodernism, a trope which is constantly highlighted throughout postmodern narratives. So if you look at a postmodern novel, say for instance The French Leftmontist Woman by John Fowles, you find that the entire novel is written in a very unreliable kind of a way, and more importantly, it is quite metafictional in quality. So this metafictional quality in postmodernism is something which is which we must bear in mind when we do a very sophisticated study, when we attempt to do a sophisticated study of postmodernism and how it connects to culture and cultural studies. So what is metafiction? Metafiction is or meta storytelling is a way of looking at fiction which is about itself. It is self-reflexive in quality. It draws attention to its own ontological state. It draws attention to its own constructed quality. It draws attention to its own fluidity as a narrative. So the postmodern narrative, more often than not, whether it's a cinema narrative, which is a diegetic quality, it's a diegesis when it comes to films, whether it's a literary narrative, we find unreliability becomes a very important condition in postmodernism. So the entire idea of ontological reliability, ontological stability are done away with. And notice there is also a sentimental quality in postmodernism. Now, when it comes to modernism, when you read a novel by Joseph Conrad, for instance, you find that the idea that the story cannot be told, the idea there's no center, the idea there's no reliable narrator left, these are ideas which are, these are realizations which are lamented, which are mourned by Conrad. So there's a very nostalgic quality about modernism which looks back at the past and tries to retrieve an era where reliability happened, where certainty took place, where things did not become contingent, etc. But when you look at postmodernism, there's no nostalgia left. There's no longing left to recover a lost whole, recover a lost paradise. The paradise lost is something which has happened, and postmodernism becomes, in a way, a celebration of a very carnivalesque centerlessness. Now, what do you mean by carnivalesque? It's a Bakhtinian term used by Mikhail Bakhtin. It's a kind of a strategy, it's a kind of a mode, a kind of an activity where normal notional orders, hierarchical orders are overturned. So the Pope becomes the beggar becomes the Pope in a classic carnival. And so that becomes a metaphoric example of how hierarchy is inverted, how normal hierarchical orders are done away with in that kind of a condition. So postmodernism becomes, quite interestingly, carnivalesque in quality. It also becomes heteroglossic in quality. It has many voices. Heteroglossia has many voices, many languages, many representations, etc. So this multiplicity of meaning, this carnivalesque of meaning, this becomes very, very important categories in postmodernism. So moving away from the modern lamentation, the modernist lamentation, the modernist nostalgia for lost origins, for lost paradises, postmodernism becomes a celebration of centerlessness, or certaintylessness. And this is reflected in the way narratives are formed in postmodernism. This is reflected in the way how slipperiness and unreliability are foregrounded by postmodern narratives, not concealed. So when you look at classic realist narratives, realism obviously is a very important category, because realism aims at totality. Realism gives an illusion of totality. Realism gives an illusion of an omniscient, omnipresent totality, which is done away with when it comes to postmodernism. There's no totality left in postmodernism. So in that sense, postmodernism becomes a very anti-totalitarian perspective of looking at things. And its anti-totalitarian perspective is something which is constantly highlighted by Lyotard. So there's no grand narrative left and postmodernism. And so we have different micro-narratives, different language games, which are often collusive with each other, which often collide with each other. And this entire play between contestation and collusion, and again, we can't quite map out the differences between contestation and collusion in the postmodern times. This very messy mixture, this very messy, mutable mixture, is something which is celebrated by the postmodern theorists, by the postmodern pundits, not least by Lyotard in this book, The Postmodern Condition, Report and Knowledge. So that kind of an acknowledgement of messiness, a foregrounding of unreliability, an exposure of certainty-lessness, a revelation of the constructed quality, these become very, very important tools, very, very important sort of epistemological instruments with which we can examine culture and cultural formations and cultural narratives, because oftentimes we find that in cultural narratives is aimed towards a tendency towards totalization, and this tendency towards totalization is something which postmodernism warns us against. Something which can quickly become totalitarian quality, something which tends towards totalitarianism, and these are important warnings, these are important suspicions. So a suspicion of postmodernism against grand narratives is a very important warning, a very important guardedness against any kind of totalitarian formation. That's something which Lyotard highlights quite often in this book. So the postmodern condition is a very important text in terms of looking at discursive formation, but also in terms of looking at affective formations. So one of the key categories in postmodernism is also affect, sentiment. So the postmodern is also a sentiment rather than just a structure or just a text. So this entire idea of a sentimental subversion is something which postmodern does quite well. So sentimentally, it doesn't have any melancholic, mournful longing of a lost whole, but rather it is quite slippery and subversive, and it laughs at itself. It's a very self-reflexive, slippery subversion. It keeps drawing attention to its own reflexivities. It keeps drawing attention to its own textual constructed quality, and in that sense, it becomes a very subversive statement. And again, we can connect this idea of postmodernism with Butler's idea of looking at gender as a verb, as an activity, as an act of becoming, unbecoming, rebecoming, etc. So these become very important distinctions, very important categories in Butler as well. And lastly, we find that this idea of the postmodern condition, as I mentioned a while ago, it's quite post-structuralist in the scope as well. So post-structuralism, post-humanism, gender studies, postmodernism, these categories come together, and they oftentimes we see them occupying or inhabiting or sort of overlapping with each other in terms of historical synchronicity, in terms of historical temporality. So all these begin to take place with the the end of Europe as a grand narrative, the end of the Western civilization as a grand narrative, which was what happened after the Second World War. So the Second World War may be seen historically as the beginning of postmodernism. However, there's a caveat that I must offer here. If we're looking at narrative structures, it doesn't necessarily mean that every narrative designed after the Second World War becomes postmodern by default. So I urge you to look at postmodernism or postmodern as not just a temporal category, but also as a stylistic and aesthetic category, as an ontological category. So for us in literary studies, if you go back to the earliest days of a novel, we can find that Don Quixote by Cervantes is a profoundly postmodern text, because again it talks about the unreliability of narration. It talks about the non-causal relationship between the signifier and the signified, the semantic slipperiness between the object and its meaning. These are questions which keep getting asked in Don Quixote. Later on in Laurence Sterne's Tristram Shandy, which is one of the earliest novels written in English, we find that it's a novel which constantly highlights its own formative process. It's a novel which constantly highlights its own constructed quality, how its narrative is being formed. So the entire novel is about writing the novel, it's about designing the particular novel. So it doesn't really have the clinical close quality of a classic realist text, which is, as we know, is something of a disguise, something of a masquerade, something of a trickster job, because real life is not full of closures. Real life doesn't really have an omniscient narrator. Real life doesn't have any sense of reliability. Real life is profoundly unreliable. Real life is quite contingent, quite complex, and quite mutable in quality, and sometimes quite messy in quality as well. So the postmodern representation, the postmodern aesthetic sometimes actually becomes the most authentic form of reality, despite its constant foregrounding of unreliability, despite its constant revelation of its own constructed quality. So in this sense, the postmodern condition becomes a very political condition, as well as a very experiential condition. So the postmodern condition becomes a revelation of our own experientiality. It tells us things about our own experience: unreliability, contingency, immutability, messiness. So these become very experiential condition in the postmodern times. And the report on knowledge that Lyotard offers over here is a very important report, precisely because it brings in scientific reports, scientific knowledge, and talks about how those become quite collusive with discursivity and different ideological climates at different points of time. So I hope to establish by this lecture by now that this is a really important text for us in cultural studies, not least as it gives us a training to look at culture as a text, to look at culture as an experience, which is also a text. So textuality and experientiality of culture are both sort of highlighted in this particular book. So this particular book becomes a very important training for us in postmodernism, not just in cultural studies, but also postmodernism as a literary activity, as an artistic activity, as obviously a political and cultural activity. And in that sense, it becomes quite a prophetic book, because as I mentioned a little while ago, that this book is actually more true to our times today than when it was originally written many, many decades ago. Because the question of identity, authority, agency, these become very crucial questions for us today in the world that we inhabit and internalize. So with that, we conclude the introduction to the postmodern condition by Jean-Francois Lyotard, and we move on with the text in the subsequent lectures. But I hope to have established by now that this is a really important text, and not just that, it's not a standalone text. It connects to some of the other texts that we do in this course, not least with Butler's Gender Trouble, Hacking's The Social Construction of What, Michel Foucault's What is an Author, and lastly Slavoj Žižek's Welcome to the Desert of the Real, which is the final text which we'll do in this particular course. But this book, The Postmodern Condition, is a really pivotal book in terms of its connectivity and relativity, relatability to the other texts that we all endeavor to cover in this course. So with that, I conclude this lecture, and we'll move on with this text in the lectures to come. Thank you for your attention.